I'm Kaylin Carlson. I'm the founder and director of Choose Grace International. Choose Grace International exists to tend to the heart of reproductive loss. We offer hope and healing to those who have been harmed by abortion. We also offer education to help others understand abortion and to help others understand how they were ever able to have abortion. Sometimes that's the biggest question. We also offer the latest research, especially on the moral injury of abortion. So oftentimes in research, we understand why women have abortions or why couples decide to have an abortion, but we don't often research how they feel about it and how they feel about it. .com. Again, that's choosegrace.com. Well, good morning, everyone. We're so glad to have you today on Saturday, our second day of the Summit of Grace. I have guests today. You all are in green. This is awesome. Oh. We have Dina, Lexi, and Tim Swab, and Tim Swab is our executive director, or executive producer for the Summit of Grace, and he's just been phenomenal. But yesterday, wow, that was a packed day full of information. We hope that you were able to watch. And today's packed with a lot of new material, and we're so excited to get started. But we kind of really I wanted to bring Tim on because there was a moment that I went up to Tim and he had tears in his eyes. And he also was saying, this is really making me angry. Mm-hmm. And it just occurred to me that there might be moral injury with people that aren't familiar with this topic. And so I asked him to come on. Thank you for coming on and just share with me some of your thoughts about yesterday.
I found myself, when we're back behind the scenes here, most of the time we've got so much going on that we're pretty disinvolved from the content. And sometimes though, I find it impossible. And we were listening to something yesterday, and it just started. I just felt this anger rising in me on two accounts. One is that the issue of abortion and its harm, what it does, what's going on, it's rarely talked about from a man's standpoint, and what happens with men involved in the whole process of this, the discussion. Almost always we're talking about it in terms of women and their rights and what's going on. Is it a baby or is it not a baby? But we often leave out of the discussion, what is it like to be a man in this situation? And I do have experience in that. And I you go through time and I started hearing them talk and I was like, yes, I'm angry on two accounts. One is the lack of good information and its ease of getting to it. So the disinformation that's out there is very strongly said, and it's often said in ways that do focus on a woman's rights. And I get that. I understand that that's a discussion to be had. I really do. But one of the things that just excites me so much about this summit and what you've put together here, Kaylin, is that there are many experts talking from many different angles and different points of view from the science. We talk about, are we going to listen to the science? Well, let's talk about the science and what's really going on, and let's have a discussion on what's going on here. And then the other thing that just made me a little angry was that the men are left out of this, and this all just talked about with what's women. But there is moral injury to men involved in these processes as well.
Absolutely, and I know my friend Greg Hassick, when I met him, that was his struggle. And he has shared that he went to pregnancy resource centers to try, to get help, to seek help from men, and there wasn't any.
There's not any.
And so, that served a passion for him to want to help other men, and go into this line of helping others because he knew that.
Yep.
And, there is, they've developed like a Lost Fatherhood, Men in Abortion Network, just for that. And we have Warren Williams also that does healing with men. So they are being recognized, but you are absolutely right. And so many times, even in the churches, we just talk about women, and we talk harshly too. We talk about women just going and killing their babies, but there's also men. Men are just as responsible, right? And we talk about legitimate authority. Part of that legitimate authority is responsibility, shared responsibility, and trust. And so we've taken that out, and we've taken men out so much that when you get pregnant, Tim, it's just like the woman feels like, I've got to be able to do it all. I've got to be able to provide, protect, have a career. I've got to. This baby is all my responsibility because we have taken men out of that responsibility. And when a woman gets pregnant, now what they're doing is, well, it's your choice.
Right.
And then it gives them the ticket out, unfortunately. But there are some men, and you can look up, there's some precious videos of men being outside of Planned Parenthood screaming and pleading and yelling, don't do this. And they are traumatized because they have not been able to protect and provide for their child.
It's within our nature to
Exactly.
protect, and when we're taken out of that decision process, it's not right. I'll just go with that far. It's just morally not right to take us out of the process, whether we want to be in it or not. It's not right to take us out of that decision-making process.
And for men, I can't imagine, because you want to just protect and you just want, that's my baby, and I can't imagine the feeling of helplessness that would be in a man.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I know I've shared that I didn't give my boyfriend a chance.
Yeah.
And, that's just devastating. It's
Yeah.
devastating to me. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So today, for any other comments about yesterday, I don't want to.
Well, I was just going to say that a term that I learned across this journey was collective moral injury, and it affects society, men, families, friends, and I think that even if you weren't the woman who had the abortion, anyone else involved is also just as affected, or affected in a different way. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, is that it's not just women, it's everyone involved.
Oh, it's a great point.
Yeah, it is.
It's a great point.
Right, that stood out to me yesterday as well, because even if you don't have a personal history of abortion, you start to realize, well, if I'm part of a church, or if I'm a person who is part of an organization, or if I have any kind of leadership, I have say by what they hear in the schools, by people's attitudes, by op-eds. So really, if we have a voice, we have a role and responsibility to take this information that we are now hearing and do what's right with it.
It's good.
Yeah, thank you. And you are right as far as, it being collective moral injury. And we're going to hear more about that even on, I have to say too, there is so much coercion that we don't hear so often with abortion. And, we're going to have Phil Klein come up on Sunday. And like I had shared, this is part of my journey, how God weaved my journey together. And, just about how sometimes, many times we have dropped the ball protecting the most vulnerable. And at 17, I was vulnerable and I was in crisis. And I was naive and believed what I was told. And so we're learning more about this. And I hope that what this does is, so many times women's like, I did it. They take all of the responsibility on themselves. But no, it takes, I think Rachel McNair, I can't remember exactly how she said it, but it was more like it takes a society to do this, and it's going to take a society to undo this. Mm-hmm. So, well, today thank you, and thank you, Tim, for sharing your thoughts. So today, Saturday, one of the big moral dimensions of healing, or the moral dimensions of the moral injury dimensions of the injury is shame, guilt and shame. And I can't tell you, Curt Thompson has got it down, and he is a neuroscientist. And neurobiology, I'm just happy I can say that word, but we're looking at the neurobiology of shame and about attachment and how we can attach unconsciously and consciously with our babies before we actually have a baby. But we are going to talk in depth with Curt Thompson about shame. And I know shame was one of the hardest things. Like he says, shame doesn't go away. Shame is universal. And just because I may have gotten rid of my shame from the abortion, that doesn't mean I don't still experience shame in other dimensions. And so this is going to be so rewarding, and it's a very, very lovely interview, one of my favorites. So here he is, Curt Thompson, with shame. Well, hello, Curt Thompson. How are you today?
Caitlin, I'm well, and I'm better because I'm talking to you.
Oh,
so
you're
it's
so
great to be here.
You're so kind. Thank you so much, so much for being here. And I met you at a conference, and I bought your book,
Yes.
The Soul of Shame. It is phenomenal. I recommend everyone to purchase this. It's Curt Thompson, The Soul of Shame. And I loved it so much, I heard about the anatomy of the soul. Here's the anatomy of the soul. And now this is not a quick read, is it? It talks about so much. So I'd like to, just at the very beginning, if you wouldn't mind, just talk through maybe what the anatomy of the soul is, and then we'll really dive into the soul of shame. But I'd like to get an overview of what the anatomy of the soul is and how it functions. So
Sure. I think that when I wrote that book, I was really trying to find a way to put language to a lot of the work that we've been doing with patients, that work having to do with new discoveries in neuroscience, how the brain works, a number of different ways in which how we talk about the mind and what it is and so forth from a scientific perspective, and how that neuroscientific research is kind of connecting with and interfacing with the gospel. How does it connect with the biblical narrative, this notion that we are people who've been made by God, loved by God, recreated by God, regenerated by God, loved so much that he becomes one of us. The whole gospel story of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, ascension. How does any and all of that interface with what we would say is the creation, right? Neuroscience is a scientific body of work that looks at the world, that looks at the creation. And as St. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, he said, like from the beginning of time, people look at the creation, and the creation speaks to us about God's power and God's personality, God's way of being in the world. We look at the creation, we can see about his nature and his power. And what we're discovering, I think, is that in a world that does not seem to pay a lot of attention to common ways of proclaiming the gospel, God is using the very neuroscience that he has created as yet another fresh way of bearing witness to how he has come into the world and is loving and regenerating the world and culminating and bringing this world to consummation at the appearance of Jesus that we Christians believe is going to happen. And so what this book does is that it really gives people a grounding in neuroscience, but it's written for the lay public. It's written for people who are interested in these kinds of things. It's not an attempt to give somebody a graduate degree in neuroscience. You do have to do some work, I think. And it also invites people to do some work around, their stories and their narratives, really kind of delving into like, well, how does my memory work? But how does the way my memory work actually affect my life? How does emotion affect my life? And how does knowing more about how that operates how does that, affect things for good or for evil? And then it's an attempt to give us an idea about how the gospel really can actually, we can use neuroscience as a way to retell the gospel using fresh language that gives people a way to encounter Jesus in ways that heretofore they've had a hard time encountering. I think that so we live in a culture where so much is expected of us in terms of belief. Like I'm just supposed to believe the gospel like I believe that 3 times 2 is 6. I can memorize 3 times 2 is 6, but that doesn't really mean much to me other than just it being an abstraction. And so I think one thing that people have said to me about the book is that this book gave me a language. It gave me a way of kind of conceptualizing and making sense of what I've been hearing from pulpits and Sunday school teachers for a lot of my life. This really kind of put, skin on the bones, as it were, and, gave people a better sense of, understanding, like, what does it mean for my mind to be renewed? When St. Paul writes that, right? Like, okay, my mind's supposed to be renewed. Like, what does that mean? And how does that work? So my hope is that when people read it, that their exploration and exposure to the neuroscience actually reinforces and gives them a fresh appreciation for what they're reading about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, just the few pages, I've already highlighted so much. One of the things, that we talk about, with abortion is there's so much shame and isolation and fear about telling the story because of just because of the shame and the social stigma.
Right.
And I like what you said in your book when you said when a person tells her story and is truly heard and understood, both she and the listener undergo actual changes in their brain circuitry. They feel a greater sense of emotional and relational connection, decreased anxiety, and greater awareness of and compassion for others suffering. And Kurt, this is exactly when I was at my lowest, when I shared it with my pastor. I had told it, a select few, but it is right because you store all of that anxiety, that then there's a release. And when you connect with someone, that's so powerful, isn't it?
Right. I think it's really striking. One of the most telling stories that I have that has really kind of compelled me in the Gospels is the story of Jesus and the rich young ruler as told in the Gospel of Mark, because it's only told this way in that Gospel, that once the rich young ruler has asked him, "What must I do?" and they have their conversation, and the text then reads, "And Jesus looked at him and loved him. And then he said to him, there's just one thing that you lack." Like, you could tell, like, Jesus got this cat, right? Jesus, this is a kid who's coming and saying, what else must I do? What other work do I have to do to get Dad to love me?
Wow, that is powerful.
To let me in. And Jesus is saying, you don't get it. You don't have to do anything. In fact, you need to stop doing what you're doing because there's no work to be done here. And this is the thing, right? In that particular story, this is the challenge about empathy. This is the challenge about feeling felt, because at the same time that I desperately need to be seen by you, at the moment that I am seen by you, there is the risk that like when all my shame comes pouring out and I see myself being seen by you, there's a part of me that may or may not be able to tolerate that very well. And I may, like the rich young ruler, turn and run because it's too difficult to be loved that deeply. But for most people, and especially if in the presence and in the wake of abortion, where there is so much shame that is experienced in so many different dimensions of that person's mind's experience, physically, cognitively, emotionally, visually, sensorially, numbered, like all these different domains in which our mind is disrupted by this shame event. I need that kind of empathic sense of being known in multiple different domains. And so all that more reason for why being known, being seen, having someone be present to hear me tell my story. And I may have to tell my story to that person many times. Because the first time I tell you, and I sense this empathy coming from you, and I haven't seen that, and I don't know how to make sense of that. I might feel this initial resonance, and my brain literally begins to turn neural networks on that have never been turned on before, but that you are now turning on by seeing me. You turn them on. I might feel that, but I may have felt intimacy of that kind before, and look where that landed me. Mm-hmm. And so do I trust what I just experienced or not? So I may have to come back many times. Did what Kaylin say to me, is she serious? And so this process of having our story be told is something that we learn never really ends.
And I like what you say, because what we do, we talk about healing in layers.
Wow, yeah.
And that there are new things that come up. Oh, I need to heal from that. And one of our speakers, she had been raped, and with her abortion, she had ended up having 3 abortions. And her insides were so scarred that she was not able to have a baby after her abortions. And she just realized I think she's like 56, somewhere around there, but she just understood all of a sudden, getting older, that she's not going to be a grandmother. And so there was this whole other cycle of loss, mm-hmm. and grief and shame, it took her back. So yeah, right. It's in layers, but I also like what you say about all these different connectors, with our well-being. It's so much different, it's the holistic, the biological, psychological, social, spiritual, we're all connected. We're all connected to each other. So I love this book, and I would recommend it highly to anyone. I have not finished it, but I'm just so excited to finish it. But like I said, I read slow, and I just want to take it all in. So thank you so much for this great work. And being known, when I am known, when I have stepped out in faith, and when I have been able to trust someone with my heart, and to have them hold me, like just a few minutes ago before the recording, Dr. Thompson, you said, I'm sorry that happened. I'm sorry that you were hurt. And I just kind of welled up in tears, because it's so wonderful when someone says that to someone, to someone that has been harmed. And just that connection. I understand you. I hear you. And I hear that. So that was very powerful for me. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So let's move on to the soul of shame. And we can always, bring up parts with the anatomy of the soul. Can you describe kind of what shame is? And then you talk about the shame cycle. So describe what the shame cycle is, and what makes shame different from guilt.
Well, let's talk about shame and guilt first and their difference. In research that looks at that, first of all, I think we talk about these notions, shame and guilt. It's important for us to recognize, first of all, that these are they're not just some abstract ideas. They are particular neurophysiologic and neuroaffective responses that we experience. They are things that we experience first and foremost in our bodies, and developmentally, the thing that we experience that we call shame is a phenomenon that we can begin to encounter when we are probably somewhere between 15 to 18 months of age. So long before we have language, long before we have some sense of understanding, like why I feel ashamed, or I feel ashamed because this happened or that happened, 15, 18-month-olds don't have that kind of cognitive capacity, but we can see them experiencing shame, demonstrating shame. It first shows up sometimes, it can show up just like, it looks like shyness, but we then attach other experiences to it. So for instance, on the other hand, also a physiologic phenomenon, actually, whatever it is that we call guilt, that particular matrix of cognitive and emotional and behavioral combination doesn't usually start to show up in children until they're somewhere between the ages of about 4 to 6 years of age. Why is that important? Well, first of all, shame is something that begins early and we practice it often. What we call guilt doesn't really show up until the brain has developed enough in order for a couple of things to happen. First of all, when I just have this sense that this is what their brain doesn't really have an easy time of discerning, like, who is me and who is you? Like, you did something, I feel bad, but am I able to discern that I feel bad because you did something? No, I'm not able to do that. I just know that I feel bad, and I'm associating it through my memory neural tracts. I'm associating it with a particular event. I'm associating it with things that I've done, and I now sense and feel this. I can't separate. But when I am 6, 4, 5, 6, my prefrontal cortex, the part of my brain that enables me to be most human, I'm now able to separate myself from the world and able to be able to say, oh, this person, I did something and hurt this person's feelings. I did something. I affected this other person. This is why we like to say that guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is also this sense that we experience in which I am able to recognize that my behavior has actually created something that the other person feels like. I notice that I've hurt them. I don't just separate myself from them, but I recognize that my actions have an impact on another person. But here's some of the most interesting data. If you look at even up through college age kids where these research exercises have been done, we will see that if a person has a rupture in a relationship that they trust, right, a trusting relationship in which there's a rupture, which they've done something to hurt the other person, they've done something wrong. Guilt, when they experience what we call guilt, what they will almost invariably do is they will turn toward that person. They will seek out restitution. They will seek out forgiveness. They will say, I'm sorry, because they want this relationship to be made whole. That particular kind of neurologic experience tends to turn us toward people. Shame does the very opposite. And this is why it's such a big deal, why we differentiate between these two things. Shame is the kind of neurophysiologic event that by its very nature, not only does my brain's function functions, my mind's functions, what I sense, what I image, what I feel, what I think, how I behave, get separated in the mind. They don't come together as a kind of like a coherent whole. They get cut off from one another. Not only does that happen, I get cut off from you.
Mhm.
I turn away from myself internally, and I turn away from you. Just like the dog lowering its head. I turn my shoulders, I turn my head away from you, I turn away, because the very notion of turning toward you increases my felt sense of this awful thing that I call shame. And this is why when shame happens, we need somebody to come find us. I'm not likely to come to tell you that I feel ashamed. I need you to come and find me. This is why we would say that when it comes to the gospel, when you read the scriptural texts, so often when we hear about sin, we also hear about shame. Right back through the Old Testament, we don't hear about guilt as much. We hear about shame quite a bit. The whole notion of Good Friday, right? The whole notion that God says, I am willing to be in a place where I will experience shame to a degree that you can't match it. There's no shame that you experience in which I won't come and find you. I'm coming for you. And I don't want you to be afraid that your shame is too big for me, because like I've been where you are. And I think this is why it's so, I mean, this is what evil does, right? Evil wields shame as a way to separate us from within ourselves and to separate us from each other. And in Jesus, God is saying, I'm not having it.
That's beautiful. And Jesus took all that shame, didn't he?
Yeah.
You.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that, you talk about in your book was, the very first sin with Adam and Eve. We hide from others. We also hide from God, just like Adam and Eve did. And God pursued them, but they were hiding. And before they sinned, they felt no shame. And the first thing the Bible, that's what they referred to. They had no shame.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for that. So, how did you decide to write The Soul of Shame? I mean, why shame? I mean, you've had experiences, right? So,
Yeah.
shame's universal, right? So,
You could have to be the factor consistent if we were made to create beauty and goodness in the world, that beauty and goodness is anathema to evil. Evil can't tolerate that. And so shame isn't, again, just being used as an example of what happens when we disobey God. It's not just the outgrowth of, what happens when we sin. It is a way that evil uses to keep us from creating beauty. It keeps us from creating the next good, beautiful thing. Whether that thing could be the next conversation that you're called to have, right? That could be the next interaction that you have with repairing a rupture with a friend. That beauty could be the next sermon that you preach. That beauty could be the next new piece of software that you make. But you think like, no, I can't do that because I'm not smart enough. Like, well, that's shame talking, right? It's like, that's the next new stage of life that you want to know. I can't because the abortion, the shame of abortion still hangs over me in so many different layered ways, as you so rightly described. And so again, its healing is important, not just to relieve us of feeling bad, commissioning us to join him to create new things in the world.
I love how you said that. That was eloquently said. And, it took me, and I'm still working on it, but it took me a long time to feel beautiful again. Because, and I have some stories here, but, many times women feel like a monster because of what they did in a crisis moment, in a fear moment. A lot of times abortion is based on fear of the future, fear of finances, fear of how I'm going to be able to handle this. And so, they're in that crisis, and then they have the abortion, and then the emotional side kicks in. And for me, it was when I went into denial. I knew I was changed. And, I was told I would never have to think about it again. Well, that's called denial, when your conscience is telling you well, what you had said between the guilt and the shame.
Right.
And so it is something that we have to deal with. We just can't sidestep it. But it was when I saw the ultrasound of my next pregnancy. And, there was trauma there because I saw that, the head, the feet, the hands, and the sonographer said, "Oh, look, your baby's waving at you." And I just wanted to leap off the table, Kurt, because I realized what I had allowed to have happen 7 years prior to when I was in high school. And, what should have been the most beautiful gift to see my child in my womb, it was fraught with trauma. And I wanted nothing but to bolt from that ultrasound table and just run away from myself.
Yeah.
But, that was impossible. I couldn't run away from myself. So that was the first start of, I had some trauma with it, but denial and denying that shame, it's not healthy, is it?
And I think that, we talked to, you mentioned earlier about this shame cycle.
Yes.
I think that denial is all part of that cycle. This sense that I feel shame starts to come to the surface. I start to sense it. And then I tend to do things basically to prevent myself from having to experience this shame. And, I tell people, when we experience shame in isolation, right, when it's just me and I've got this shame for whatever reason that I've got it, the trauma of abortion, it could be anything. It isn't just the shame that is the problem. Functionally, the problem is that I experience it in isolation. And so the cycle is such that I sense it, I turn away from it, I double down on keeping myself unaware of it. I put it in the locked storage room in the basement of my mind's house. And then I have to burn energy to keep it there. But that's not going to keep life from coming at me. And life is going to come at me, and things are going to happen that are going to echo what's in that basement storage closet. And it's going to want to come to the surface again. And I tell people, it's kind of like, if you had to If I were to give you a 5-gallon bucket of water and say, Caitlin, could you pick that up? You could pick it up. You could pick up a 5-gallon bucket of water. And if I were then to say, well, that's great because we have a 4-mile hike that we're going on and you get to carry the water. 200 yards into this trip, the weight of the water itself hasn't changed a bit. That shame that's in that basement locked closet, it hasn't changed at all. But that's not what it feels like to me. I'm 200 yards into carrying 5 gallons of water, and I just want to throw it on Kurt. I'm sick of carrying this because neurobiologically, neurophysiologically, this is in fact what does happen. We have to burn energy, and that energy wears us out, and I just have to double down on holding my bucket. And sooner or later, the reality of life is going to make it such that I won't be able to keep carrying it in that way. And I tell people this, apart from major head trauma or kind of, infection in the brain, or a major psychiatric disease process, Alzheimer's disease and so forth. Apart from that, the brain is a very with it, when in fact,
Have been isolated, not understanding what would be good for me and what would bring me energy and healing is when I am vulnerable and that I do share. And, it's so important too to have friends that you trust and love and that can build you up and pray for you and encourage you. And, and one of our scripture verses is, two are better than one. When one falls, someone can lift the other up. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
right. And I think I would go further and say, we are a culture that, we've got lots of fire stations, and, fire trucks don't just routinely go out and kind of roam around in the neighborhood just looking for fires. No, they wait in the firehouse, and then we call them and then they come, and as is proper for them to do. But a lot of us live our lives like that, in that, like, I'll think about telling somebody when something comes up or if there's a problem. But the reality is, it's really important for us to be in relationships that on an ongoing basis are confessional in this way. I can't wait for the next evidence of my shame to percolate to the top for me to then go talk to somebody, because I'm actually less likely to do it then because I'm feeling so bad. But if I am in a regularly cadenced pattern of telling my story more truly to somebody, it becomes a pattern, and actually I get to learn how liberating it is to regularly put my stuff on the table. I've got 2 other guys that for the last 24 years, every Tuesday morning, we're in the room together now virtually. We're in the room together, telling our stories more truly to each other. And if I don't have these guys, I'm a dead man, because I don't have to wait for bad things to show up. We're just telling our stories every week. And that practice means that, and we are imperfect at this, but practicing it means that shame has less and less oxygen to breathe in each of our lives.
Yeah. And you have with your, now tell us a little bit about your organization, because you have developed community groups for connection. Is that correct?
Well, in the private practice that I'm part of, we have over the last number of years developed what we call confessional communities, and we call them that. I mean, to anyone else, we would call this group therapy, group psychotherapy, and we do them in a couple of different ways, and our purpose is to give people a space where there's 6 or 8 people together in this group, men and women together. Two of myself and another colleague will be working with these groups, in which we invite people to tell their stories, and we meet once a week for 90 minutes. And over the course of the time that we've been doing this, I have witnessed transformation, the likes of which I think I could never have predicted. I think there are some reasons for that. And one of those reasons is we're talking about shame today. I tell people, to address shame is kind of like this metaphor. If you were standing on a sidewalk and an empty red wagon was pushed at you at a speed of 2 miles an hour, you could put your foot out and stop the wagon. That's not even walking speed, right? 2 miles an hour, you could stop it. But if you were asked to stop a locomotive that was moving 2 miles an hour, you couldn't do it. Because it's not the speed, it's the mass of the object. Shame is like that. It's not a red wagon, it's a locomotive. When I carry my shame into a room where I've got 5 or 6 or 7 other people,
Bye-bye.
who are holding that, who are speaking truly to me, who are hearing this empathically, week in and week out, there literally is the only way you'd stop that locomotive is if you had a bigger locomotive that could stop it. And this is what we bring to the table. We bring a bigger train, is what we bring. Because we want people to know that no matter what you bring, you can't make us leave the room. We're not leaving the room. And so when people tell their stories, there's just an endless list of events in which I've watched people in the room be transformed because there was a part of their story that they were sure that once it was exposed, people would either want to leave or ask them to leave.
That's where I was at, and that's
Right.
why it's so many men and
Right.
women, yeah.
And we find that it's important to have both sexes in the room, right? Because in this way, people are working out their stuff with their dads and with their moms and with their brothers and sisters and with the pastor who sexually abused them and so forth and so on. And they're working out their, post-rape shame. They're working out, everything in a context in which we are going to be confidential, right? Nobody's going to be taking this out and just spreading it everywhere. So that confidentiality, right? The base word of that is confidence, right? It creates confidence that I can tell my story truly. And it's not just that I then tell you the facts, but when my shame is held by you, and I now no longer have to burn all that energy to hold it, that energy is now available to me to imagine a different story. And the story that I imagine differently isn't just something that I make up in my head. It is something that the people in the room will help me begin to tell. Because these are people whose faces I trust, whose voices I trust, whose body posture I trust, because my body felt the release of my shame when, as I told my story, I saw the tears in your eyes. When I told my story, you said that you feel protective for me. When I told my story, you feel angry on my behalf, and so forth and so on. Those kinds of communities, I would suggest, are the kinds of outposts of goodness and beauty that the gospel calls us to become. And they don't just have to be in those kinds of psychotherapy groups. These kinds of groups can emerge in any domain of life.
Yes, that I'm so excited to learn more about that. That's incredible. And when you were talking, I was thinking, of a community like the community of a pastor. Because the church, is not always, the church isn't perfect, but, we need to forgive the church when they hurt us. And we also need the church to forgive us when, we fail to, live up to,
Sure.
what is the best. And so all the, my father who had said that, he would kick me out of the house if I ever got pregnant, that was his way of trying to prevent me from getting pregnant. But when I did get pregnant, I heard that, and, I didn't know how to survive. I was 17.
Yeah.
So you're not really in that, your moral development. I knew it was wrong, but there's, when you talk about the psychosocial development, I only thought for the day, anyway, and that whatever reason, even if whatever reason there was for an abortion, God still loves you. I like what you said. And when we connect with others that will share that love, the shame does release.
Yeah.
And, God used my son, through my son, to demonstrate how much he loved me. And, it got to the point where I felt God saying, Kaylin, you can either choose shame and regret for the rest of your life, or you can choose my grace, which is sufficient for you. Now, which do you choose? And I choose your grace. And then it was after that the shame lifted, although, shame comes back, but the shame lifted. And it was at that point, yes, that I could understand. I started to be creative. So, I love your illustration about the locomotive, because all that energy was to try to suppress it. But
Right.
To release it was, gave me energy, gave me more clarity. And I did start, being creative and focusing on other things.
Right. One thing that we also like to talk about in when it comes to this, and I would hope that our listeners today, I would hope they would hear this as a word of encouragement. In embryology, right, in the development of an embryo, in the development of, like, as we, the zygotes, develop, eventually there is what develops is a thing called a germ cell line, right? So it's a line of cells that, if you were to just look at them under a microscope, under an electron microscope, they'd all look the same. They don't look very different at all. But out of that germ cell line comes eventually all of the different things that we have as people, right? They come as my eyes and my ears and my nose and my fingers and my intestine and my feet. Like, all these differentiated parts that come from a line of cells that at first glance all look the same. But they aren't the same. And they develop in different ways, and they show up at different times, right? That's how the germ cell line begins to sprout and grow and so forth and so on, which is why in utero you have all these different ways in which the child develops over time. The brain doesn't develop first. It takes a while for that to happen, and so forth and so on. It's important to know that shame has its own germ cell line way of working in this way. We might confront shame for the first time because of a certain set of circumstances. We confront shame because of an abortion, or we confront shame because I had an abusive parent, or we confront shame because of my alcoholism, or because of my sadness. It could be anything. I confront it. And as we work through shame, as it applies to that particular part of my life, I become confident. I become more creative. All those things that we talk about. And we can be fooled into thinking that because I've worked through shame effectively in this particular domain of life, that I've worked through shame effectively across the board. And then something else happens, and shame shows up again, and it feels just as sharp as it felt before, and I'm wondering, what the heck? I thought I already worked through shame, period. And we find, oh no. Like, you think evil is going to go quietly into the night? No, it has plans for you. It's going to wait until the proper time. You know, when we read about Jesus' temptations in the desert, he fasts for 40 days, and then the devil comes to tempt him. The scriptures read. All four gospels report this. And in many respects, this is exactly what the devil says. If you are the Son of God, basically saying, you're not really the Son of God, are you? The accuser comes. This is shame at work. And in Luke's gospel, when this is all done, the text reads, and the devil left him for another time that was more opportune. The devil left him for another time. Jesus didn't just get his shame taken care of one and done right then and there in his work in the desert. He was doing work in the desert to get him prepared for when this is going to show up later. And so this is another thing that I think is really important for why regular cadenced connection with other people is important. Shame is going to show up, and we need not be afraid of it. We simply need to be prepared for it. And this is why, you know, when you read Luke's gospel, it seems like, you know, Jesus is either up early or up late praying. Up early, up late praying. Up early, up late. And I would be surprised, if what he's doing is he's part of that is he's preparing for what's coming, making sure that he's aware that when that pang of shame shows up again, when he's tempted to go down that road, oh, you're not really God's son here after all, are you? That he can be reminded, just like he said in the desert, when Jesus says, it is written, when he says that to the devil, you know, for a Jew to say it is written, it is the same thing as saying, God has said. And for Jesus, for God to have said, it would be like him saying to the devil, yes, but my dad says. And we all need our dad to be able to be speaking on our behalf.
Yes.
And our mothers to be speaking on our behalf. And this is why confessional communities and being in that connection with other people who are speaking, helping us to tell our stories more truly is so crucially important.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. And, you know, they're all the neighbors within that community and just loving each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of strength in that. So I have a question. This is such a wonderful interview. One question is, how can pastors, minister leaders, and others talk about reproductive loss, including abortion, in a way that is not shame-inducing? You know, I know that it's a challenge because, I just know it's a challenge, and I know that when I have shared sometimes, things have been said to me that have hurt me. And I fear that a lot of men and women, because the statistics now used to be 1 out of 4 women, but I've heard, you know, 1 out of 3 women by the time they're age 45 will at least have had 1 abortion. And something we don't consider too is that it's not only the women, you know, there's men there too. It's a men's issue as well. And right. And also it's a church issue too, you know, because sometimes, you know, clergy, you know, like I had a client once that, you know, we don't need to get, but where the pastor had driven the daughter to the abortion facility and said, don't come out pregnant. So you just know that the family dynamics of that, and maybe even the hypocrisy of we gotta shine bright and not, you know, hide the shame of your pregnancy. Right. So, I mean, it's just a very difficult subject, abortion in the church. And I've wanted to say, I've been hurt. And a lot of times, you know, with the sanctity of life, you know, they talk in terms that bring shame. And I know that sometimes shame is our responsibility too, to take care of, to do something about it. But again, how can pastors and minister leaders talk about abortion in a way that is not shame-inducing? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think there is, and this gets right back to Good Friday.
The what? Sorry?
It gets right back to Good Friday.
Okay.
And here's what I mean. With Good Friday, Jesus, as my friend Brad Jersick points out, Jesus consented to shame. The Romans, in our artwork, I think we all know that the Romans crucified people. It's generally considered, crucifixion is generally considered to be, there's probably been no form of crucifixion, no form of execution that's ever been devised that has been more heinous than this. But the Romans didn't just torture people with this, they also humiliated them because, Jesus didn't have any clothes on.
Right.
But moreover, he wasn't placed 50 yards away from the main drag. He would be placed right on the side of the road. He's no more than 6 to 8 inches off the ground. And this is where people would be. What's my point? If I'm a pastor, one of the most powerful things that I can do for those people who carry shame is to be making sure that I'm dealing with my own. And so the first step for, how can pastors help others who have this shame? I'm like, I would want to know that pastor is taking the kinds of steps that are necessary for her or him to be able to name the shame in their own life. Because I will tell you, if we are not in touch with the shame that we harbor, we're not following hard enough after Jesus. I like to tell people, the news about shame is far worse than you know, and far better than you can imagine. But getting to the part where the news is better than we can imagine first requires us to go to where it is worse than we know. When any one of the pastors that we might imagine does the work of exploring, where does shame show up in my life? When they finally make contact with that shame, they will know in their hearts that all they will want to do with those with whom they are working is to empathically welcome them to the table. They will know from right in the center of their solar plexus that if they're dealing with someone who's had an abortion, they will want to say, could you come to my house for dinner tonight? We want to host you for dinner. We want to hear about your story. We want to hear about where things are hard. And we want to do everything we can to help you dismantle shame where it lives in your house, where it lives in your life, where it lives in your relationships. We want to love you as much as we can.
That's beautiful.
I'm only going to be able to do that to the degree that I'm actually doing my own work. And, this is, I'll just say this as to wrap this part of it up. I don't know that there's anybody in the world that has a harder job than pastors. There are lots of hard jobs in the world. I don't know that anybody has a harder job than a pastor. And one of the ways that job is hard is that they are expected to call people to change who are also paying their paycheck. They are not protected with a set of boundaries that says, at 5 o'clock every day, you're done. And they are not given the opportunity often by their congregations to say, in order for you to lead us well, we want your soul to be as well tended as possible. So we're going to do everything we can to create a space for you to take care of all of your broken stuff. We want you to lead us, and we want you to be unafraid to do that. If a pastor doesn't have space in which he could, like we say to people, you can't give people what you don't have.
So true.
And so if I'm going to be merciful, blessed are those are the merciful. If I'm going to be merciful to those in my congregation, like unto this, I'm going to have a place, my own confessional community, where I also can be shown mercy.
Absolutely. That's very good. Okay, so we're running out of time. I just could talk to you all day. If there are any viewers in the audience who would like to seek help, how would you encourage them? I feel like you've already encouraged them, to share your story, but where can viewers go to learn about your work and, some of the techniques that you provide for free on your website with the reflections? Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll close.
So they can go to kurtthompsonmd.com, where they can access there are blog posts, and there are some resource exercises that they can do, and a range of those different things that they can do. There's, they can see there where they can, purchase the books that I've written. There are blog posts that I've written. If they want, they can download for free a chapter from The Soul of Shame. If they want to get a taste of what that's like, that can be helpful. It's not uncommon, Kayleen, for me to maybe get a call every now and then from folks that aren't in the Northern Virginia or the Washington, D.C. area. Where I live in Dallas or I live in Minneapolis, where can we, get help in the kind that you're talking about? And I don't always have resources for those folks, but I would say this. There is probably in most parts of the country there is probably a church that has an awareness of a counseling center in the area, right. And so that would be one resource for your audience in particular, who may be facing what it's like post-abortion. There may be pregnancy centers may also have resources for folks. Resources in terms of pointing them in the direction of where they can go. I do think that sometimes I would ask the question, do you have one friend with whom you'd be willing to take the risk of telling your story? You have one friend. It's risky. God knows that it's risky. Jesus picked people who threw him under the bus. His 12 disciples, they all leave at the end of the day. And so he knows that this isn't easy. But I want, and then I know it's difficult because sometimes people will hear these kinds of interviews and they will get their hopes up because this sounds like something that we can do that can bring a change, and it can and it will. And then they go looking for it and they're like, I can't find these people. Like, where are these people who want to be this honest with me? And, I don't just swing a cat around and hit 3 of them. And I want to say that I want you to trust in the slow work of God. I want you to trust that God has taken a long time to get us to where we are. He's not forgotten us. In the same way that when a toddler or an infant has fallen and is in trouble, their concept of time is such that even if it takes mom 30 seconds to get there, it feels like a lifetime. But mom's coming for you. Your God is coming for you. And that's a hopeful thing.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you so much for this interview and for all your work and for being here today. I thank you, and God bless you and all your work. And we're excited to hear about your next book. So looking forward to that.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's been a joy to be with you. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, wasn't that a great interview with Kurt Thompson? And shame is real, and shame is what we've said universal, and shame follows all of us. I remember, like reading in the Bible, right after Adam and Eve sinned, and the first thing that was mentioned is before the sin is they felt no shame.
Right.
Then after the sin, they felt shame.
Right.
So, what have you learned from, like, the women with the stories? I mean, have you seen the shame? Have you noticed how devastating?
I've seen the shame, and I've seen, watching Kurt's interview, Kurt just gave such a compassionate and strong story of the rich young ruler. And I think sometimes when we look at stories about Jesus and biblical stories, sometimes we take our own lens, and because we feel shame or because we, just because of what we feel about ourselves, sometimes we miss that tenderness and love. But Kurt was saying, Jesus saw this man, and loved him. And I think, sometimes it's like that shame, that what Kurt was getting at with that whole piece was, the shame can really block us from feeling the love that is there. And I know for some people, there's situations where people who should be loving aren't loving, and that's so painful. But there's other situations where, because of toxic shame, there is love available, but it just can't get to us because of what shame has done.
We almost feel undeserving of the love that people are
so
trying
many
to give
times,
us.
yeah.
And we try to block it out and ignore it because we feel like we don't deserve what people are trying to offer us.
Yeah, I know that, I've been, I don't deserve it. So, yeah, and that happens so frequently with abortion. So Dr. Harold Koenig, he has given us permission to adapt his curriculum that he's done with the moral injury with combat veterans to the moral injury of abortion. I just want to share a statement that he's made about shame, and it's about guilt and shame. So I'm just going to read this. Guilt and shame are not the same thing. Guilt and shame are both functions of the superego, or the conscience, or the Holy Spirit. However, shame involves greater self-consciousness and self-imaging. It is more about personal identity. And so many times you'll hear women say, I felt like a monster because I had the abortion. So it affects your personal identity. Shame is a feeling about the self that arises from the consciousness of having done something dishonorable or improper. It is about ourselves. Whereas guilt is the remorse that one feels for having committed a crime or wrongful act that affects others. So it's about others. So depending on the particular personality of the individual, one may experience either shame or guilt or both as a result of actions during wartime. In this case, it's actions during abortion. For example, shame over having deserted one's comrades during the battle to save oneself. Let me repeat that. For example, shame over having deserted one's comrades during the heat of battle to save oneself. So the moral injury for abortion is, for men and women, shame over having deserted one's own child in the heat of the crisis to save oneself. Shame is distinct from guilt in that shame involves injury to a person's self-identity. It involves a kind of hiding that is kept to oneself and poisons the soul. You think about poisons the soul, and so many times, what we don't understand is the abortion is a wound to the soul, a wound to the heart. And that's where, like a lot of this research, they're not researching that area. They're not researching the soul wounds, the moral injury of abortion. Therefore, it is deeper than guilt. Does that make sense? I know you guys, you've not had abortions, and I'm just very thankful of that. But does that help you understand me better?
It does. It really does. And I think it helps me understand you. And I think for some of these pieces, it kind of helps me relate because we've all made mistakes. We've all made different mistakes. We have different regrets. And I think that a lot of times the lie that we feel is you're so alone, you're the only one, it's just you. Only you have this, like, it's like this icky ness on you, and everyone else is great and fine. So it just, I mean, I feel so much compassion. I felt, kind of starting to tear up when I was hearing the word hiding,
Well, and I was with an interview with Tim Clinton with AACC, and he's shared before that he had a woman coming to him, and
Right.
she was saying, "You're not going to like me. You're not going to like me." And that was the same thing with me. My husband and I, we were leaders in the church. We taught youth group. And I just felt like a fake and phony. I felt like that false self. Here's what they're saying about the identity. I self-identified. If they only knew I had an abortion, they wouldn't like me. They wouldn't want me to teach the youth. They wouldn't even want me involved in this church. And I also, I say like this, like I felt like because of my shame that everybody was here. This was God's world, and we had all these people. But then I was outside. I was not allowed in here because of my shame. And that's where, too, with the moral injury piece, you have religious struggles. Yeah. And there is a myth about, like, if you're religious, that abortion, like the church is making you feel bad about the abortion. Yeah, that can happen. But you're already feeling bad because of the shame, because it's the conscience, if that makes sense. So there's a myth that, the church is making me feel bad about the abortion. Well, there has been harm because they don't necessarily understand the depth. Because here's the crux: is like with the American Psychological Association, they, through their particular research, their conceptual framework that they're using to frame the abortion, they're saying it's just as easy for a woman to have an abortion as it is for a woman to have a child, a baby, within like the first Martha Shipping. They reduced it reduced it down to the first abortion. They reduced it to not just to have relief. There's a lot more that you feel, but it was part of that reductionism. But no, there is great effect on the heart and the soul wounds. So I wanted just to share with you a couple. So these are affidavits, and these have been presented. There's 400, like over 4,500 affidavits, and this was just a great segue. You didn't mean to, but when you said you're not alone, no, you are not alone. So there's like 4,500, and this is just a very small sample of you are not alone. 4,500 affidavits that women have shared how abortion has harmed them. I just want to read just a couple. One of the questions is, were you adequately informed of the nature of abortion, what it is and what it does? And the answer was, there was no counseling. I was just urged to make an immediate appointment to take care of it while it was still a blob of cells. There was no counseling. I was just urged to make an immediate appointment to take care of it. And I know for myself, I called it. I didn't call it a baby, we call it it, while it was still a blob of cells. And there's that mental, it's kind of like you have to morally disengage. Well, if it's just a blob of cells, if it's just a mass, then that's okay. So you're okay just to maybe morally disengage to be able to do that. Does that make sense?
It does.
So then it's, how has the abortion affected you? It says, I turned to drinking, drugs, and sexual promiscuity. I had an unnatural link to the father of the baby. All these things led me to make wrong choices in my life. At one point, I was suicidal. Based on your experience, what would you tell a woman considering abortion? And she said, it is not worth the pain, shame, depression, feelings of worthlessness or guilt. Abortion almost ruined my life, and you will face the consequences of your decisions. Abortion is not the answer, and I will do anything you need me to do for you to bring your child into this world. You are not alone. Mm-hmm. And then another one. So, were you adequately informed? I knew that I would not have the child, but for years I dreamed of becoming pregnant again. I do believe that the abortion damaged my organs. She said, I was 14 years old at the time of my abortion. I was informed of what abortion is, but never did I understand the emotional, mental damage in the aftermath. As a young child, scared to tell my mother that I had been raped, the day she took me to find out I was pregnant and found out that I was, I remember her saying, your father is going to kill you. I really believed this then. Maybe not so much now, 24 years later. So based on your experience, what would you tell women? Not just no, but hell no. I would tell them to consider adoption and make the final decision until after they gave birth. So and there's I could just pull out all these stories, but the shame, the identity, and so, I love the piece that you brought in about Kurt Thompson's about the shame and the emotional energy it takes to keep that shame down. But when we acknowledge it and we work with it, to acknowledge that pain is some of that first process of becoming whole again.
Right. I think one thing that stands out to me so much when you talk about shame, and you said that, sometimes the church or someone else does some of the wounding. And I think that in certain circles, people get this attitude that if someone has an abortion, it's like they're other or they're different, or there's these attitudes of where women who had abortions it almost feels like it's separated. But when you really stop and you get into the stories and you think, where was I when I was 17 years old? How easily was I influenced by what I was told? And I think it's like this human nature thing where we just want to, you want to think it couldn't have been you, but the truth is, it could have been me. It could have been anyone when you really look at, well, how vulnerable was I? And, what if this different set of things happened in my experience? And I think part of the shame is that, we think we're so different from each other, but it could have been me. It could have been so many people. And I think that it's for everyone to kind of realize, whether you're someone who has had an abortion or whether you're someone who has not had an abortion, to realize that we had different sets of circumstances. And I think that sometimes the shame can be some of that interpersonal piece. But if we would just learn and listen, I think that would come away, because the more you learn, the more you look at yourself and think, oh yeah, I was pretty vulnerable, or oh yeah, I believed what teachers told me, or oh, if this boy that I liked so much told me, I'm really upset that this happened and you need to go do this, and I was only 17 years old, who knows what I would have done. So I think a lot of the shame piece is that it's like we divide ourselves up from each other when we really shouldn't be dividing ourselves up from each other. We should be listening to these stories and thinking like, yeah.
Well, this is a point I was planning on bringing up today. So I've had a lot of women talk to me and say, and this is where it gets to the heart of the matter, where they would say, well, I was having sex in high school, and had those been the same, had that happened to me, I would have gotten an abortion. And so to me, that's like, this is where we are as a nation. That's, and I think I'm thankful for them to say that, because they would have had one. They just didn't get caught like I did. And you know, when you're young, you think, oh, that's not going to happen to me, you know, young and dumb. And so I appreciate when people say that, yeah, I would have had one. And I think, too, when we're going to talk about it later, how we are groomed, how we've been groomed to have abortions. And that's part of, you know, the legitimate authority, you know, that has failed us, being groomed to kill. Because when you think about it, how is I so able to do that? You know, not knowing, you know, it was a baby, not, you know, just the massive tissue, the cluster of cells. But there's a lot more, and there's a lot more coming up on how exactly we're marketed to. And that's coming up later in the sessions. But I appreciate that, you know, acknowledging, yeah, I would have done the same thing had I. Yeah. Lexi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, same with me. In high school, I was taught pretty much what you were taught, what the options were, and that growing up in a Christian home, that wasn't an option. But if I were in that situation, you never know, because you always just put it in the back of your mind that would never be me. But you don't know until, and when you're hearing these stories, I heard so many people's stories, and Dr. Priscilla Coleman's coming up later, and she did a big meta-analysis on tons of different stories, and some of those stories were the same person as I am, like growing up the same way, being involved in the same thing, so you have no idea. Like, it could be you, but yeah, so I really enjoyed her research, and she's coming up a little later.
Yeah. Okay, so next is we have Catherine Coyle. I met Catherine Coyle years ago, and she works with men. But she also has a forgiveness model, and we're going to be talking. She's going to be talking about the men in abortion and about her forgiveness model. And actually, we go through quite a few techniques on how to forgive. So I'm excited that she's coming up, and I appreciate that she did this interview. So it's Catherine Coyle and on forgiveness. So hope you enjoy it. Welcome, and thank you so much again for tuning in to our Summit of Grace. And I have an expert, and so thrilled to have Dr. Catherine Coyle with us today. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Coyle.
You're welcome. It's good to see you after all this time.
Yeah, we met several years ago at a men and abortion conference. And you are, I believe, I'm not sure, but you're one of the first authors to, you know, recognize and to help men heal from abortion through your work with the book we're going to be talking about. Is that correct?
Yes, there are very few people interested in the topic.
Yes. And just so our viewers know, Dr. Catherine Coyle has also, we have interviewed Dr. Rachel McNair and Dr. Martha Shuping. And we're not going to be talking so much about this, but I want the viewers to know the chapters you've written and how important and a good reference and resource this is. So you have chaptered several chapters. And one of those chapters is intimate partner violence. And then the chapter 2 is coercion and or pressure for, the abortion. Chapter 3 is sex trafficking. And we are going to be interviewing Dr. Laura Lederer in a bit about the sex trafficking. War, there was a chapter on war that you co-authored with Rachel McNair. And then gendercide, sex selection abortions. And then also the chapter that, we're addressing today is lost fatherhood. And this, I think is that the ones you've done, or I missed? Yes, okay. So very, very important resource. And Dr. Coyle has written this book, and it's a treasure trove, and we're going to be kind of talking through that. And just so excited again, Dr. Coyle, for your work and for how you're going to bless the viewers. And I know I've been blessed by understanding what men go through, because so many times we don't hear about the men, let alone the women. And so tell us, what inspired you to write this?
I was working on my doctorate, and Dr. Robert Enright was my advisor, my student advisor. And he was beginning to study the topic of forgiveness. So when it came time to do my dissertation, I wanted to do something that could be potentially useful. So my interest in forgiveness then was aligned with the hurt of elective abortion. And I chose to work with men because there was just nothing there. And I'm happy to say the program went really well. I learned a great deal from some of the best teachers, the men who experienced a partner's abortion, and they experienced significant improvements in the measures we looked at. They increased in forgiveness, their anger, their anxiety and helplessness, those things significantly decreased. So Dr. Enright was happy and I was thrilled.
Oh, I bet. And, along those lines, why I think that this is so important is because as we study the moral injury, this summit is talking about the moral injury of abortion. And, we have the 10 dimensions of the harm, and what you just mentioned were several of those dimensions. So, we're just honored to be able to go through this. And ladies and gentlemen, we are supplying a workbook for the summit, and Dr. Coyle has graciously allowed us to use some of her material in here. As we will explain, you will have the putting the ideas into practice that she has so generously shared with us. So you are going to be able to get a wealth of information and to keep, for your use. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Coyle.
You're very welcome.
Your
Very
book,
affirming.
oh yes. So your book is divided into 2 sections, and part 1 is the background, and you have like 4 topics. One is the legalized abortion impact on men. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the impact that legalization of abortion has had on men?
Well, as I said, and this isn't just now our research, but the research in general has some common findings. And we're finding that abortion is definitely not a benign experience for men, and that is by their own descriptions. Some of the more typical reactions are anger, often feeling of helplessness or powerlessness, grief, profound grief, that enough, guilt, anxiety, which can affect the ability to concentrate, for instance. In our largest study, and this is not a large study by research standards, but in our largest one, and that was with Priscilla Coleman and Vince Rue and myself, we found that of the 198 men we surveyed, 43% of them met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So we cannot extrapolate that to the general population. The study was too small. But common sense tells us that when human beings make a decision or disagree with the decision to end the life of an unborn human that you've had a part in creating, that there might be some problems. And we certainly found that there were. And so we have a lot of silent, wounded men walking around with nowhere to go. Who do they talk to? They're not acknowledged as having any rights. And they're trying very hard, at least during the actual decision-making process, during the discovery process of an unplanned pregnancy, we found that their main goal often is to suppress whatever they want and whatever they're feeling and support their female partners. So they're marginalized and left with unfinished business.
Yeah, and they have to just, like I know I've had an abortion and I had to tuck those things away because I thought I had to get the abortion. And it's kind of the same thing for men, they're having to tuck away what they feel, is right or wrong, and just to be supportive. And it's sad, but how beautiful that they care for their woman, that they just want, so much to be the man that, they think she needs. But so, my heart goes out to men. And Catherine, I have difficulty because I never gave my boyfriend a chance. And he had offered to marry me. I mean, he did all the right things, but I was just so set on having an abortion. And so, I've often wondered, and I'm for his protection, and we won't go into his story, but I did ask for it. I did make amends, and so I took part from my responsibility. So. And I hope as we talk more that that can happen, that people make amends with each other and be able to reconcile this. So your next chapter, the post-abortion stress in men. Can you talk a little bit about that, the post-abortion stress?
Well, it is very much similar to what you would see in PTSD. And Dr. Vince Rue, as you know, made that connection many years ago concerning women's experience, and we're finding some very similar things in men. They seem to be more at risk, although there's always exceptions. I remember one of the men I worked with doing my dissertation research, I think had full-blown PTSD. I suggested he bring that up with his counselor that he was seeing because he had all the symptoms. And he actually pushed for the abortion. So regardless of how men's goes in terms of that decision and the outcome of the pregnancy, any of them can be at risk for psychological harm after the fact.
And you've mentioned some that are on our sheet that, you have graciously provided us, problems relating to anger, frequent angry outburst, frequent feelings of anger toward the self or the partner, examples of problems related to helplessness, confusion about a man's role in society, or feeling inept or unable to function as a man. And then also anxiety, difficulty sleeping, disturbing dreams and nightmares. And I did have nightmares myself. And also problems related to relationships. And we're going to be interviewing a couple that I know that this was one of the things that you talk about is that the other person feels like they're doing fine, that they're coping fine, but when they're really not. So problems related to relationships is isolation, feeling either alone or deliberately choosing to avoid people, fear of relationships, promiscuity. Can you talk a little bit about that, the promiscuity?
Well, when you asked me that, I immediately thought of a couple of the fellows I worked with since the research. They just had this attitude of who cares? Who cares? If women are going to treat me that way, then I can exploit them as well, which is very sad.
That is very sad.
And I'm not making any excuses for that, But that's where some of that comes from. I think it also comes from casual relationships actually feel safer than a committed, intimate relationship. Because what if this happened again?
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, and then you also have, there's sexual problems such as impotence. And then a big one is difficulty trusting women. Now, we know with moral injury, you know, what happens is there's a trust issue. You grow up, I mean, you start, I can't trust myself because I made such a horrible decision, or I didn't do this, or I didn't do that. Those woulda, coulda, shouldas. But also, you know, trusting in the other partner, trusting in the man. So just as women now might not trust men to be able to protect and provide and to be there, also men have trouble trusting women. Now, what does, I mean, that, can you a little bit more about that?
Well, again, that comes back to more those men who are opposed to the decision, who feel that they were in a committed relationship, that it was going somewhere, that they had some hopes for this relationship. And then their desire to continue that pregnancy and to care for that child, even if it meant caring for that child on their own as a single dad, was simply ignored. So they feel like they trusted the wrong person, like they themselves can't be trusted to recognize a trustworthy person. They feel helpless. They have no legal rights. I mean, keep in mind, every one of these guys is legally liable for 18 years minimum of child support. But they have no legal recourse when it comes to trying to protect an unborn child. So it's not a surprise that some of them generalize this mistrust then to women, because women hold the power.
Yeah. That's interesting. Thank you. So moving on, I know we could stay on that topic for a long time. The next portion of your book is about forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the 4 phases of forgiveness. And we're going to go through the psychological model of the forgiveness. Catherine, I know for myself, you know, why forgiveness is so important, because, you know, it just helps break the chains of, you know, the detrimental effects of abortion. What do you see is so important about forgiveness?
Well, I think it's the only thing, the only option, if you will, in terms of responding to an unfair, deep injury. It's the only option that's going to get you healthy. Because if you stuff it, sooner or later, we know it's going to seep out in some way. If you deny it, you're not living with the truth. If you excuse it, well, you might be telling yourself a story just to move on. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for any kind of deep, unjust injury, not just. Whereas when you get into the forgiveness process, you're really looking at that injury honestly, your own responsibility, others' responsibilities, what's affected you, and what some healing and some hope for your future.
Yeah. And, you know, and God's purpose for you in your life, because, yes, you know, He doesn't stop loving you. You don't stop having gifts and talents that you can use. And, you know, so many times I know for myself that, you know, kind of stunted my growth. So we're going to move into the part 2, which I'm excited about, and that is healing after abortion. And we're going to kind of walk through your process of forgiving another. And I love your points. There's four phases. The first phase is the uncovering phase. Mm-hmm. And I'll just let you share for a few minutes what that looks like.
Okay, first, I want to back up a little bit.
Okay, sure.
And we always, those of us who studied with Dr. Enright and Bob himself, we always start out with distinguishing what forgiveness is and what it is not. It's not excusing, then the person would not have done anything we should be upset about. It's not stuffing, it's not ignoring, it's not minimizing. It's also not reconciliation. It is very simply making a deliberate decision to withhold what would be justified, perhaps, retribution or resentment, and instead offering that other mercy. So that's where we start when we present information about the forgiveness model. It is known as the Enright forgiveness model. And that is also where I started working with men. So they knew right up front what we were going to be talking about. And their responses were interesting. They were at best guarded. At worst, are you kidding me, is what I got. But they all hung in there, and they all succeeded in getting to the point of forgiving. So we begin with the uncovering phase. And when your participants or viewers look at this model, they will see 20 units in this model. And I want to emphasize right up front here that it looks like a linear model. It is not. We are not saying people need to start with step one and go through it. They're going to be all over the board. The phases, on the other hand, and you brought up the uncovering phase, which is the first one, they tend to go in order. So we'll start at the beginning with the understanding that we may have to cycle back on occasion to different steps. The uncovering phase has 8 steps or variables. In that phase, what we do as we try to forgive, or as we try to guide someone else through the process, is first of all, look at how we might be trying to defend ourselves. Are we really being honest with ourselves about how the experience may have affected us? Are we being angry, and are we spilling that anger onto other people who have nothing to do with the situation? Are we feeling shame and embarrassment? I'm going to look at my list of steps here for a moment.
And I learned a new word from you, awareness of, cathexis.
Yes, that would be the next step. In fact, that has to do with the emotional or psychic energy we attach to an object, a person, or an event. So in this case, it could be the partner, it could be the actual abortion event. So that's something we would talk about. How much energy do you think you spend on this on a day-to-day basis or a month-to-month? Not everyone thinks about it every day. But how much of your life's energy is being, emotional energy is being spent?
And I'd like to add to that, I've listened to so many stories, and, one thing that, like in a crisis call, someone will say, I am never going to forget this. I am never going to be able to forgive myself. And others have said, in their stories, I think about it every day. I think about it every day. And the analogy that someone had spoken about it is like you take a big beach ball and it's like keeping that beach ball underwater and not letting it surface. Mm-hmm. And that beach ball grows, and the more you try to deny it and keep it down, the more it wants to spring up. So I'm like, that's the word. I just didn't know that word was kind of describing that. So that's very helpful to understand.
And imagine then how much of your energy is being, in a sense, wasted when it could be put to use in other ways, in looking at it and working towards. Another thing we look at in the uncovering phase is do you find yourself thinking about this over and over, replaying the event, or replaying in your mind what you should have done or could have done? Again, that uses up a lot of emotional energy, and emotional energy can be just as exhausting, its expenditure, as physical energy. So again, we're trying to get people to uncover how they've been affected. I would ask the man to consider if he has compared himself to his partner. If his partner seems like she's doing just fine, that might increase his anger. Or it could be that she seems devastated and he doesn't know how to help her. And that's just adding more pain on the pain he's already carrying. There is also the realization that when you are hurt, you may be permanently changed in a negative way from that injury. Certainly abortion is a permanent solution to a perceived problem. So yes, we don't minimize their descriptions of being permanently altered, because that's reality. And they need to find a way to live with that and still find some hope and joy for their future. And finally, in the uncovering phase, we look at something called an altered just world view. And I think especially for men, again, because they have no legal rights, there's no legal justice for them when it comes to protecting the unborn. Many of them feel very victimized and like the world is a very unfair place. And what can they do about that? Legal rights. So overall, the goal in that uncovering phase is really to help the man explore how he has been affected by his partner's abortion, and also how he is reacting. How is he thinking, feeling, and behaving because of it? So not just I'm hurt and I have grief to deal with, but how is that coming out in other relationships, in your work environment? Are you able to still find things to do that you enjoy, or is even that been somehow dampened? And the whole bit, let me back up a little bit here, because the very first step is denial. And I wanted to say this and I forgot. We have to be very careful, I think, about making assumptions that anyone is in denial because they are not reacting to what we would perceive as a very serious event in the way we would expect them to. And we also have to be very careful not to deconstruct that denial without some gentle exploration of how the abortion has affected him. Because denial serves a purpose, and we all use it now and then. But anyway, so again, the overall plan here in this phase is to find out, what has this event done to me? And oh my, when I'm really honest about it, I realize it's hurt me and it's affected me in negative ways, which is a nice segue then into discussing the next phase, the decision phase. Because forgiveness offers a way out of this. It offers some light at the end of the tunnel, some hope for the future, so that you're not stuck just peeling off the scab and looking at what happened and how you're feeling. Now, during the decision phase, I found that I often needed to again emphasize, I am not talking about excusing. I'm talking about forgiving somebody who doesn't deserve to be forgiven in that boat, both sides. So that's only a few steps, and it's basically exploring again what forgiveness is, assuring the hurt individual what it does not mean they have to do to forgive someone, giving them time to think about it, and asking them if they're willing to at least try. And that's enough to move into the work phase.
And then the work phase, let's spend a couple minutes on that.
Okay, well, that is aptly named because they've already done a lot of painful work in uncovering. And now they have to work harder, or at least as hard, I should say. And the first step or unit in that phase is reframing. Again, this is a point where I think you have to be very careful if you're working with people who are trying to heal after an abortion, really anyone, but that's our focus here. That when we talk about reframing our view of the person who hurt us, we are not talking about excusing them. We simply want to enlarge, literally imagine a picture frame in which we view that person. We want to try to be sensitive to all of it, how they felt at the moment, why they were afraid. Career, are they perfectionists? What's their personality factors that might have affected them? And I think you can see how some people might perceive that as making excuses. Well, they had it rough in their family growing up. So I found it really important to repeatedly emphasize this is not about excusing, it's about trying to build some empathy for their situation. And from that empathy, then actually feel genuine compassion for them in spite of what they've done to you. Every one of us has been hurt deeply. We know how hard it is to do that. It's a lot of work in this phase. And for Christians, a helpful thing is the notion, the teaching that we're created in the image of God, every one of us. So that gives us all inherent worth. And that is, I think, the largest context. When we start finding ways to recognize one another's inherent worth. And it doesn't have to be in a religious sense. One of the guys I worked with described it this way, and I thought this was a wonderful description. He said, the fact that human beings have the potential to choose good and evil gives them inherent worth. He was not a Christian, but this is how he saw human beings. And it worked well for him in getting through this and being able to look at his former partner and see her as somebody who also needed healing.
You know, he was the one that introduced the abortion, but then when he saw the ultrasound, you know, and then they